Okay, I have a lot of issues that I guess I want to cover. So I was going through some videos on my computer that I had saved and downloaded, and one of them was Stefan Molyneux having a debate with the creator of the Zeitgeist films. Can't remember his name. I'll try to find maybe the title of the video, although it might, hopefully it exists in some form still on YouTube. Anyway, and it was interesting because that was sort of, I don't know what year this debate happened, but it was interesting because everything that the Zeitgeist man was saying, the this filmmaker and sort of at least one of the people at the center of the Zeitgeist movement, was a kind of preliminary rendition of sort of social justice, and it's kind of and it's racialist, sort of. It's interesting. It's almost the kind of the it's almost like a non-racialist. Well, yeah. Anyway, I mean, you could call it radical leftism, perhaps, or something like that. Anyway, and you can see the kinds of the fractious arguments that it gets into, which Stefan Molyneux says, like, well, you're just throwing adjectives at me. You're calling my worldview truncated because and you just basically have a narrative. Putting slight words into Stefan Molyneux's mouth, but I think that's generally how the loggerheads came into view. That they that essentially the Zeitgeist guy just has a narrative, and he literally complains that Stefan Molyneux is not allowing him to have his narrative, while he never proves any of his claims. He never makes a proper case. Stefan Molyneux says, you're not making a case. You're just labeling things. You're just So it's all bound up in the kind of in the predicate and the assumption of the worldview and the framing of reality. And Stefan, in this debate, it comes out quite beautifully, like in many different places, how sort of how strangely reductionist the systemic structural oppression narrative is. How weirdly dehumanizing it is, how sort of decentralized it is in terms of just how inhumane it is. Like it doesn't, you're not a participant in the system. You are just another cog in the machine, and you need to be treated equally from this kind of systemic perspective. Otherwise, justice isn't being done to you according to the systemic oppression or the systemic violence that is being perpetrated against you. And this perspective is very strange. It is very dehumanizing. And when you get into some of the examples that they get into, that Stefan Molyneux sort of complains about, well, actually, why wouldn't a disease that only affected 200 people as opposed to 200,000 people in some different country, why wouldn't I be interested in the 200 people if my daughter was one of the 200, if I wasn't one of the 200, or if I wasn't a health um, officer or some person in the health department, in which, well, the 200,000 people dying is in a different country or something like that. So, is this weird kind of delocalization of everything, but also essentially what this ends up underlining in the problem of capitalism or the problem of the market itself is that the market, you could call it an impersonal mechanism or something like that, that is the medium within which individuals are have a decentralized control over some immediate sphere, or at least a potential control over their immediate vicinity and their immediate participation and engagement in larger society. So it is like an impersonal mechanism that everyone is using to interface with everyone else in the system. So you could slander it that way. you could slander capitalism that way, is that where does it have an inbuilt responsiveness to some kind of moral question or some kind of ethical apparatus which is being applied across the board. It doesn't have this automatic built-in security for some kind to being responsive to some kind of human question, because it isn't a feudal system in which it all operates under the auspices of a single sovereign actor or some powerful feudal lord that can actually intervene and be some kind of administrator and get in and command and order something. And just because you can imagine, well, no, if we could just get some kind of systemic idea that people could intervene and could compel and impel things to happen so that things were better distributed. The weird thing is that you're still only distributing other people's things in some sense. That in some sense it's the idea. It's weird that on what is happening on the radical left is somehow the idea that the source of problem is relative inequality, that essentially that the evil of relative inequality is the engine of a kind of negative extraction or a kind of destructiveness or a malevolence that is sort of, and that is structurally embedded or something like that is just structurally inherited by all the participants in the system. That there's a kind of relative inequality that is inbuilt into the mechanism. And that if you just had an intervener or an intercessor to mediate all manner of transactions, that you could ameliorate that particular byproduct of the mechanism. So that's the moral marketing. That's the advocacy of the kind of radical left, that we need something to ameliorate the structural injustice or the structural malevolence, essentially, is how it's kind of anthropomorphized. And essentially what they are, I think what they are actually calling for is they are calling for a reintroduction of feudalism. They want feudal lords, feudal administrators. They want mediators to intercess and to intervene and to impel. The strange thing is that how you would even get people to intervene on this level, is sort of. So messy. It's hard to get at this. Whereas if we actually it's ironic because it's that kind of intervention which one can argue has gotten in the way and has created hurdles and obstacles and impediments to allowing people to have the luxury or the leisure or the extra capacity to be able to more benevolently choose to participate and sort of create alternative or ulterior forms of organization and things like that. I mean, I think that the state itself has largely been a stumbling block, but also the mechanism through which say tyrannical forms of sort of embedded structural sort of incumbent powers have kind of created some kind of plutocratic or oligarchical, sort of cementing of their structural power, as it were, because the structure itself is calcified and entrenched in a faux or a pseudo moral claim, and a pseudo, you see, it's weird, it's not directly a moral claim, but it's indirectly a moral claim, because essentially because they have been able to corrupt the pretension of justice which the state premises its actions in. Although that's not technically true, because I guess the executive fiat, or the governmental privilege to choose democratically its policy, gives it perhaps the cover to be able to toy with the market through supposedly some kind of legitimate anyway. So it's interesting that the technical power of the market, the technical power that the government has to involve itself in the market, the theoretical principled basis for the government to sort of to get its hands dirty. I guess we can say that perhaps liberal political philosophy, and I don't think that this is entirely fair to say this, but let me just put it as let's say, the problem of the current political challenge is that it's very good at complaining about deception, but it's not good at defending against manipulation, especially against these kinds of social manipulators that have been able to mask themselves and insulate themselves by saying that everybody else is manipulating the system, that the structural violence is itself manipulation. And instead of attacking that manipulation, they say, well, we need a kind of a positive manipulation that is corrective. We need a positive sort of feudal system to come in and I guess the scariest thing is that when they say that they need to control the machine to make it more human, that it has a human judgment that is being the mediator of the system, that is needed in order to make it more ethical and just and humanize it, that essentially, because essentially what they are tackling is relative inequality, they need a source of surplus in order to redistribute, and they need essentially to also blame that source of that surplus as being, let's say, the perpetrator of the structural violence, and without that sort of moral scapegoating, they can't really square the circle of their program, but also without without perpetuating some generation of surplus, there is no work for them to do the work of redistribution. And in some sense, they can't just generalize the problem as, oh, it's a problem of undevelopment or lack of or some kind of deficiency. They have to localize the problem as being sourced in a kind of cultural hegemony. So it's weird that essentially the failings of individuals, or let's just say the lack of development, has to be created as a positive conspiracy that has been perpetrated, that is actively and ongoing in its perpetration. So it's weird that essentially you can only define positive progress as somebody else's, as destroying somebody else's mischief, essentially. And so counteracting some kind of societal conspiracy theory of mischief, I mean, it gets. I consider this, I guess, to be quite fascistic. I mean, in its narrative. I mean, this is what the fascistic worldview is essentially. Um, is that there's some kind of secret conspiracy theory uh, that you can only positively graduate out of and grow out of, or develop against by, it becomes like a kind of a false spiritual projection. um, I haven't been tracking very closely, but I mean this is basically the kind of issue that I have against people like Russell Brand, who I imagine, I mean, they love this narrative because it makes the world small and simple and easy to imagine how progress can be made on some kind of collective project that everyone gets inducted and yoked into joining, some kind of general sort of movement, and which has this kind of lockstep worldview that everyone tethers themselves into. Um, Although perhaps I should try to listen to what Russell Brand has been saying recently so I can update my criticisms of him and that kind of pseudo intellectualism. But I mean, I think it generally it's this ongoing demand for a kind of feudalism as a way to save a kind of cultural collective spirit, or having people believing that they're all on the same side, that they live in the same quality of society that has the same kind of agenda or the same kind of vision or the same kind of definition of justice and morality or something like that. But I do think that that is generally a version of a kind of slave morality, that you can only find commonality in as much as you believe that you're all making progress against the same conspiracy theory, essentially. Rather than, I mean, yes, it is true that there are things as malfeasance, that there are things as tyrannical things and corruption, which is why, I mean, that's what politics is for, essentially. um, and political debate is for, and journalism is for, and investigation. But we have actually sort of hollowed out all of these things because of the blaring siren calls of structural injustice and social violence, or whatever you want, or structural. Essentially, the word justice has hollowed out its meaning, and now essentially, justice is just a question of, are you for this new model of feudalism or not, where essentially morality is essentially prescribed through the state. Where the state is some kind of is a moral mediator, is a mediator of what morality is. Which then, obviously, then the problem of voting is very strange, because then essentially you are. I mean, how can the state be in the function of administering a kind of moral mediation, and essentially extolling the definition of justice, rather than justice belonging to the common law, essentially, or belonging in a really settled way. But um, when the definition of justice is sort of repromulgated as this ongoing political definition uh, of a kind of political worldview and status that one has to upkeep to belong to the society, to this kind of feudalism that you are entracted into this ongoing, sort of progressive fight against this conspiracy theory. Um, anyway, so yeah, I still see that these people are trying to induce people to join their particular sort of feudalism, their neo-feudalism, which they see as the solution to capitalism, rather than essentially trying to focus on the individual or focus on the individual freedom or something like that. Well, if you don't like capitalism, then go make an alternative within it. Go create an alternative model within it. You know, why, if you want an alternative to capitalism and you feel that, oh well, it's structurally unjust that people can't choose to uh, uh, be given automatically an alternative to capitalism in which they must already just be accorded with equal, because it's almost as if, well, the psychological terror that somebody else might have like a higher status than you, or somebody else might be better in some way or something like that, that people must be psychologically protected from feeling that they may have cause to feel inferior in some dimension or some metric or in some way, as if their excellence must be bestowed to your identity, and moral consideration that is vested in some kind of collective identity. Society must ensure for you that you have an equal share, or that your identity is equally promoted and benefited and rewarded, or something like that, in the scheme of life, or something like that. It's kind of like a cosmological sort of security that is afforded by your feudal lord, by your Führer, or something like that. Now, so I mean, yeah, I do see that the so-called these spiritual people like Russell Brand, and these left-wing people like Zeitgeist people, that at least now, in terms of how that this has evolved into this kind of this complaint about systems and structure and things like that, they have completely dislocated themselves from any kind of authentic individual, sort of participation in these things. They want that participation to be mediated by the system, by some feudal system, some system of overlording. Um, and it's weird because I do think that it is almost a kind of to short circuit the meaning of life, and in some sense, it's weird that that they're lucky that they have something to fight against called capitalism, which they can kind of malign and project onto. When really what capitalism is morally neutral. I would argue that essentially it's a way of saying that power is decentralized and is put in the hands of individuals. And in as much as that there are like deep-seated structural things, well, you can't. I don't think you can legitimately hope that a system should be perfect. It's just that a system should be capable of not being, I mean, there's nothing inherent in capitalism that makes it bad. I think that what makes it bad are individual perpetrators, or let's say people who engage in morally questionable things, but the moral aspect of their activities is distinct from the economic things that they do, and in some sense, the war of ideas, the war of, the, let's say, the cultural, uh, the contestation of ideas and such. You know, that is in some sense part of the human condition that needs to be confronted, and that cannot be obscured by some kind of overlord system, that morality is sort of solved for people by mediators or by governors or rulers. And the idea that you can just kind of shift this problem up to be resolved by some kind of caste of leadership or system that gets installed that then upgrades the morality of the system is, I think, a very evil kind of shortcut solution in some sense. That kind of, I mean, it is true that you could, that with the right enlightened benign dictatorship, that you could probably effect some utilitarian positive outputs, that you could maximize, sort of things, benign dictatorship. But you would lose something as well, and you could maybe ameliorate that loss of, let's say, moral awareness and insight uh, by, education perhaps, or something like that. But that education would be, a purely hypothetical, theoretical um, act of the imagination. It, in some sense, uh, the continuance of capitalism is something like the continuance of history. It's somewhat the proof that history hasn't ended. I'm somewhat relating to the Fukuyama idea, but and in as much as and in as much as like liberalism is, I think, British political liberalism is essentially something like the inheritance of the Greek, sort of quest for understanding the soul, um, within some kind of political, uh, in let's just call it the modern epoch, or whatever. Um, and then, I can see that essentially perhaps what these radical left, sort of complainers of structural oppression are trying to do is they're trying to basically say, we don't want that burden, we don't want that liberal responsibility, and we don't actually want to intelligently demand through democracy a form of government, a form of political structure where we consider ourselves accountable for the destination of our society as a collective. Essentially it is something like the repudiation of the sovereign citizen, or the sovereign individual not wishing to have the status of sovereignty, rather wishing to have some kind of moral confection applied and mediated and administered for or on behalf of the dignity of their identity, rather than, you know, uh, um, they want a high status identity. They don't much care about like incarnated dignity. The dignity is just kind of like a virtual badge. Is just a is just sort of lip service on some level. It's just a conglomeration of adjectives in the narrative. Um, Now, I mean, I've just stated it there quite starkly and quite cynically, perhaps, but just to concretize that, to get more particular about it, is that I think that the major problem uh, is essentially the denigration or the degradation um, of morality itself, and particularly of the concept of justice. That justice has been redefined as an external, sort of objective, almost perhaps scientific attribute that can be sort of collectively agreed upon, um, or a great or develop some kind of auspice of collective authority that anyway. So justice. Um, that justice has become an object of of collective entities like identities, and that essentially the collective identity is the seat of moral consideration and vests, and so justice can only be orientated towards, in some sense, pandering towards these holders and the source of moral consideration, which are these collective identities. And so, speaking on behalf of collective identities, and I mean, this is part of the narrative of structural injustice and things like that, the individual participant has been completely abstracted into, it's been reduced out of the statistical wash or something like that. You can see this quite clearly in the zeitgeist debate with Stefan Molyneux, just how sort of disembodied the whole perspective and narrative that he's projecting is. The kind of the 200 versus 200,000 people. Which disease do you focus on? That the question itself should not be answered, the system should answer it for you. That you shouldn't have to participate and engage and live through that question. The question should be answered for you by the structure of your society or something like that, which is supposedly that will be infused in justice, so that you never have to apply yourself to that kind of question. That the system should be moral instead of individual participants. And I guess this is the problem: is that capitalism can't really defend itself for moral reasons, other than saying, well, the individual should actually, how is it fair that individuals should have moral choices when they have inequality or something like that? Because because not all individuals will have the same moral capacity. Is that really the way? Should I phrase it like that? It seems to phrase it strangely. What I mean is that not all individuals will have the same capacity to affect their moral preferences, I guess. And to even talk about moral preferences, it sounds a bit confused, I guess, like a misnomer, or they're because morality is, usually a kind of, or it should, I think, be conceived of as a rigid or a fixed judgment or discerned, sort of inclination. But obviously, the question of life. I mean, it's obviously it's much easier to engage in armchair morality if you can just amalgamate your perspective with all powers and all capacities of all human beings and all agents that should have their agency sort of collectivized and administered under some kind of feudal overlord, then you can imagine, well, then we can just basically choose to not have moral evils. We can just, because it's put under the decision of some overlord, of some agent that gets to choose for the system, rather than individuals making up a system, let's say collectively amalgamating into an anthropomorphized, sort of metaphor that someone is perpetrating a decision of electing for that moral evil or something. It's a strange inception, that narrative, that collective narrative framework. It's a very strange inception. And the let's say the denigration of capitalism, the mechanism through which we decentralize individual participation and free choice, and is essentially, I think, it is to give up the individual into some kind of feudal plan. It is essentially the relinquishing of the individual dignity. In order to affirm a kind of a strange collective dignity, which becomes essentially then the source of moral consideration, and virtue is bestowed in how well you serve that collective source of dignity. And therefore that becomes essentially what the word justice orientates itself toward serving. And justice itself loses all of its principles, and it gains, let's say, objective features. It gains, things that are agreed upon statistically, or that are factually informed, or something like that. It doesn't get made out of principles. It gets made out of just consistency of some kind of stable, descriptive narrative, or something like that becomes canonical, which is itself, I think, a philosophical sort of insoluble or unsustainable sort of thing. This is why I think fascist societies inexorably become pathetic and stupid, because they can't even sustain their own reality in some sense. And in some sense, they have to keep their scapegoat alive. They have to keep their conspiracy theory alive, because it's the only contrast in value that actually gives them a line to make distinctions around. And so they have to project that same distinctiveness onto everything. Everything needs to become a metaphor of that primary tension, or something like that. And if you do it this way, then you're on the side of the perpetrator that created the malevolence. So you create all the good things are only maintained by your opposition to let's say the effigy of the malevolent perpetrator and the conspirator that created the evil in the first place. So you have to reaffirm your feudal overlords as being the protection against the sort of the great antagonist, the great identitarian villain. And I guess it's hard to see that end of the road when you're just doing something like attacking capitalism. When you're just complaining that, oh yeah, well, it's a cold system, and it facilitates, or it allows for plutocrats to take over state power and use justice to entrench their tyrannical or corruption, or their interests, or whatever. And instead of trying to whittle down the state into essentially a into, having very delimited and clearly defined roles, and having to create policy that, essentially can be challenged on the basis of it being unjust, on the basis of individuals tackling the wisdom of the state, or that the state doesn't have a right um, to automatically generate policy that overrides common sense, essentially. That there needs to be mechanisms in which essentially the state can try to operate an agenda, but that agenda cannot be beyond reproach, cannot be beyond refinement as well, in terms of arbitrary effects that it might have over the integrity of those things that it's is casting shadows on, or whatever, or is involving itself within. This is touchy, because I do think that there are creative, inventive things that the state should involve itself in, which does, I think, involve some level of compulsive curtailment, or it does end up controlling things that it gets involved with, and I think that can be justifiable as long as the idea is good enough and it's, let's say, kind of got an even application. That it's an idea, it's a project, it's a policy device which is, has some, say, general public good, that it's orientated towards fulfilling, and it comes at a cost for private actors. I think that can be countenanced, so much as that the public good is this is why the South African Constitution has a limitations clause. That's exactly the thing that comes into it. As long as it's not essentially unjustifiably limiting somebody else's constitutional right. Yeah, I mean, I do think that the South African legal framework, although it has been largely in practice, it's been bastardized and watered down, and essentially even, I mean, there's so many things are not working at all. I mean, Julius Malema, who is basically a black fascist, says things every day which are deeply unconstitutional, and there isn't a debate in society as to how to protect the Constitution and liberal values. And this is, let me see if I can try to frame. This is such a difficult debate to have, but it's not. Well, I mean, I'm talking about having a debate about it, but in some sense, it's sad that this debate hasn't already been finished, because we need it now to protect the functioning of the legal system, the functioning of the Constitution, and the functioning of the democracy itself, which is already dysfunctional, which already has been betrayed, essentially, and is essentially has been, I mean, to a large extent has been betrayed, or it is dysfunctional because the media and journalists have philosophically undermined and betrayed democracy and democratic liberal values already, because we've already kind of orientated towards the feudal solution to all of these problems in some sense. But let me just try to frame the debate, because it is interesting perhaps for future. I mean, for if who knows how history is going to go at the moment, but in the future, if we ever want to make a republic again, if we ever want to make a real democracy again, we're going to have to hopefully this will already be settled at the start of it, essentially. So when Julius Malema makes these conspiracy theory claims, when he says white monopoly capital, and he says that, we have to, we would like to call them different names, but we can't do that yet. All these veiled fascistic, we're going to take over, we're going to have our, he's openly spoken about a coup, perpetrating a coup in the past. Anyway, the kinds of claims that he makes, which are effectively a kind of hate speech, these vague accusations, which are part of an ideological worldview that specifically attack a whole section of a population based on their race, is a form of discrimination. Is also undermines the non-racial value that the democracy is based on. I would say should signify that a political party like the EFF, that has its political leader Julius Malema having these kinds of values that are anti-constitutional values, that essentially that therefore such a political party should be classified as being constitutionally malevolent or damaging to constitutional values or anti-constitutional. And as such, the state, all state institutions and state apparatuses should not, it goes without saying directly, but should not indirectly endorse or promote or aid or benefit or help such an organization or a party. That essentially the state must shun this political entity. Now, I also want to perhaps go further, that it should perhaps go further than that. Like that the question of criminal sanctions and fines for public statements made. Now, I wonder, in terms of free speech, that perhaps goes too far. Anyway, so that's a section of the debate that perhaps but you can very easily make the argument that this is a general incitement to violence, based on racial violence as well. But I don't see why it couldn't be classified as criminal. The idea that it should not be seen as criminal merely because you're making such a general ideological statement that essentially has genocidal pretensions. I would argue it quite clearly has genocidal pretensions. But the idea that it's merely because it's fashionable now to make these sorts of statements, because because you're basically extending history. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. I need to make a video or a recording that focuses on basically what I was just saying in the last video, but perhaps more pointedly about sort of the strange, convoluted moral philosophical logic of these weird racists that anyway, let me not lose this point, but lose the point about what I was talking about. So I think that the democracy does have to defend itself and its democratic liberal values. Um, the question of how is very important, because obviously, even how it's done, it needs to be debated about how it's done, but it can't be debated about how it's done in such a way that that also undermines the democracy itself. And so it is just very interesting, because I would say that generally the kind of argument that is being made against liberal democracy, and which is the same argument that's being made against capitalism, is essentially a fascistic argument. The idea that, well, everything bad that happens is basically a conspiracy, and it's a conspiracy perpetrated by all those who just go along with the system. And so the idea is that if you are complicit, then you are a social manipulator. Therefore, their solution of grand social manipulation and what I would characterize as feudalism doesn't count as such, because it is the solution to manipulation. Because they can't be bothered to actually stop the bad things that happen, or can be bothered to diagnose them. They can just generalize about them. That's and then they can generalize them into a conspiracy theory, and that's good enough for them. So the problem, okay, anyway, I haven't formulated this exactly as I wanted to. So yeah, when I say that the state should shun this organization, obviously, you see, it's still a democracy, so you, I think that you wouldn't be able to stop them from contesting elections and winning seats. But I do think that perhaps their parliamentarian seat holders should not receive a salary as members of parliament. Um, that the institutional might of the state should not endorse or promote them in any way. Um, and that you shouldn't have to you shouldn't have to something like yeah, I mean, this perhaps this perhaps could be framed in the structure of the state better by not, and in some sense I think that also, well, the general state of things as well anyway, but perhaps just to get the structure of this functioning, is that it shouldn't be a state institution that determines, when I say state, I mean like executive, um, that determines if your party or your political organization is anti-constitutional or not, or is I don't know. I was just trying to think about how you could basically say that political parties need would not I was just thinking about a mechanism in which you wouldn't be branded as being anti-constitutional, is that you had to achieve the status of being under the auspices of the Constitution or something like that, but that would have to go through the courts in order to it can be problematic having judges and the judiciary basically in charge of everything, but sadly, I do think that you might need something as much as that to actually would have everything in place so that the society is actually protected, that it actually has the structural backbone to resist fascism and fascist politics, and be able to censure fascist rhetoric, essentially, or at least follow some model throughout which journalists and things like that can actually have some kind of institutional line in the sand which they can orientate themselves around, because this kind of food fight and this free for all that is kind of created by this the feudalism narrative is it's really disgusting just to see how few with it people are in society. I mean, just how few people are capable of sort of penetrating and seeing through the fascistic fog of confusion. Anyway, thinking that courts judging whether political organizations are actually not anti-constitutional so that they can be eligible to receive, that their members in parliament are eligible to receive remuneration from state coffers, from state funds. The ANC would also lose its status, I think, technically, for the kinds of statements that they make that are similarly sort of in league with this kind of, well, I mean, they're a bit schizophrenic, I guess, that they say things half the time and they say things the other half of the time, or their officials do. Anyway, obviously this is a bit pie in the sky, imagining that the courts would actually have the temerity, but I mean also the structure would somehow change overnight, that courts would declare certain organizations as being mouthpieces of anti-constitutional filth, and therefore their members were the members of those organizations were effectively being shunned by the state, and therefore would not be remunerated from state funds, and would not be engaged with. But they would still hold certain seats because it's still a democracy and things like that. And in some sense, I mean, and that is merely that the system the Constitution at some point does need to be defended. It does need to actually to say, well, no, we recognize that these entities within our society are anti-constitutional. They are effectively cancers within our society, and they do not inhabit the same cultural space. They do not inhabit the same mind frame, but in some sense that cancerous mind frame has largely become the mainstream, or at least, I mean, I do think that there is some argument to be had that there is a silent majority that does not comport to this filth and this, this sort of new form of politics and things like that. But I mean, you wouldn't necessarily think that um, with the quality of journalism that we are subjected to. And in some sense, I think that that moral relativism that that was capable of conveying, this kind of this new definition of justice and things like that, happened because there's really no good defense of principles in the democratic system. So, so what was that debate that I wanted to open? So the debate that I want to open is essentially how, I mean, I've said in other recordings that I'm very sympathetic with Pinochet and the McCarthyist era. I think both Pinochet and what do they call, the Commission or the Council for Activity or Anti-American Activities or whatever it was called, the Red Scare and such things, that a lot of those measures are ugly, and I think that they do. We need a kind of liberal democracy that is capable of defending itself without using ugly measures, but is capable of doing it above the board, that is capable of actually putting the real lines in the sand and backing them up structurally, so that we don't have to uh, have extrajudicial, extra legal solutions to these problems, because these are real problems. And again, I think that liberal democracy is very good at calling out deception and perhaps even uncovering deception. But when that deception comes in a differently packaged, in a form that is not overt deception, but is covert deception in the form of social manipulation and bold-faced social manipulation, that it just comes out and it just creates, sort of just from scratch asserting an entirely ulterior moral universe that has basically a fascistic world view woven right in the core of it. Liberal democracy doesn't really seem to have any way to defend itself other than, it needs to say more. I mean, well, first of all, I mean, I don't see any institutions that have stated that these things are repugnant. The lack of defense, I would say, is conspicuous, but also the level of complicity in sort of in journalism. The kind of the moral ineptitude, and perhaps there is something to be said that, well, if there aren't any of these structural tripwires in the system, maybe that is somewhat part of the problem, that the principles aren't clearly enough woven into some kind of because at the level of which that you institutionalize the kinds of protections that I'm talking about, then you can have principled arguments at each of those junctures, so that you can actually get a kind of jurisprudence which actually puts the principle into the structure itself, and actually has the ambit of the issue laid out. But yeah, I mean, I guess at the moment I'm talking about I'm talking about it purely from a kind of liberal democratic point of view, in which I've spoken about the failure of society in as much as that the values of liberal democracy and the accountability of the electorate itself has been subverted by this alternative model of a kind of feudalism. The other thing I'm going to make, I guess, a recording that tries to get into exactly the from the side of the social justice identitarian, kind of worldview, how the accountability gets vortexed into a kind of insoluble conflation that basically underwrites never-ending corruption and tyranny, um, and diverts any resistance that it gets into amplifying its never-ending sort of narrative, um, that becomes a kind of perennialism or a kind of pseudo-religious worldview. But also, I mean, it is also very dangerous on the level of psychology, I would say. Anyway. Okay, I haven't made a recording in a while. Let me maybe just try to update some ideological threads which I don't see other people making, which I think might be worth pointing to. I think what is happening in Taiwan relative to the kind of the metaphysics or the actual issue of Taiwan and what Taiwan is going through, and the strange almost hypocrisy of the American position, because somehow Taiwan deserves to be independent, even though so many people in mainland China feel that the political leadership of mainland China should extend towards Taiwan, that they should be the same shared entity with the same shared governorship and rulership on top of them, and the people of Taiwan don't feel the same way. And so, the kind of the identitarian relativism, you know, usually will, I guess you would side with ordinarily with the statistical mass, with who has more people who feel more strongly. And this is why, in some sense, there is this almost schism that Taiwan is going to be swallowed and absorbed by this identitarian narrative, essentially, that's going to override the individual liberty of its citizens. The question of independence for Taiwan, this is something like the question of, well, do liberal democratic values mean anything in this world anymore? Don't large identitarian narratives, where all our morality now comes from, because justice has been completely re-engineered and redefined. Where were you when they came for justice? And all of these weasels without principles in our society, let them take justice, let them redefine justice. And so I see what's happening to Taiwan is happening everywhere, although I think it's weirdly, strangely, ironically, schismatic that Joe Biden is standing up for Taiwan against the Chinese ethnic national narrative. Um, they're not sensitive to their own hypocrisy on that level, because well, obviously racial narratives, like are real and must be respected, because those are people's lived experiences. But what about the lived experiences of the people in mainland China? Somehow they are sensitive to standing up for Taiwan. So anyway, I think it's a blip on the radar that America at the moment seems to be standing up for Taiwan. I don't really think they're doing it for principled reasons.
Um, so yeah. Anyway, my point here is quite obscure, but in some sense, I think that we are all Taiwan right now, and we are all going to be swallowed by identitarian collectivist narratives. Uh, and that is certainly the move that's happening in America. And you know, just like in Taiwan, the reason why Taiwan doesn't want to merge with China is because there's no political accountability. Essentially, uh, uh, the it's an opaque system where there is no uh, there's flagrant corruption and mismanagement, and essentially, the quality of the rule of law and things like that. The quality of leadership is not something that well, you get essentially in an insulated oligarchy that cannot be questioned and that cannot be systematically or progressively brought to book. You you end up with untouchable, politically connected elites, and essentially you have a system of a nomenclatura, or a of coordinating um, kleptocrats, and they get to protect themselves because of the identitarian narrative, the collective narrative that just covers all of that shady power structure, and and you can never get rid of it. It just gets baked in. And so your political culture and your political arena, because it's playing this identitarian narrative and this collective narrative, you never get clean politics. You can never improve things, essentially. Um, you end up with just, these shady power games of oligarchs, essentially. And the worst thing is that the secondary economy of the identitarian narrative is that you empower psychopaths, and psychopaths that are very liable to generate witch hunts and to use the scapegoating, diversionary tactics of the identitarian narrative. um, and you get these weasel pseudo intellectuals who back them up, because it's fun to create conspiracy theories that make the world small and simple. And so, that's the way that we all seem to be being pushed by mainstream media and all these things. And essentially, what is happening, what it looms over the people of Taiwan, looms over us all, uh, sadly. And it is sad that essentially the world is becoming like the internal politics of China and Russia, essentially. Um, which is essentially a world ruled by oligarchs. It's quite sad. So, what were the points to add to this? Is yeah. So we are all Taiwan. I guess that's the one point. The other point is, and this needs to be pointed out, is, I mean, I must say, I've undergone, you could call it a crisis of faith, or something like that, just in democracy itself. Because there's one thing that you can't say, is that this happened to the people. You have to say that the people are accountable for the state of democracy. You have to hold people accountable for democracy. Otherwise, it doesn't even exist metaphysically. And so, I mean, the famous American formulation is, you have a republic for as long as you can keep it, essentially. And I do think that there is something wrong, the defect in people themselves. How few people have principles, how few people have any kind of moral rigor. uh, if the West and democracy and liberal values survive this cultural crisis. The one upside is that it will be tremendously cathartic for post-Nazi, post-World War II German culture, because the German guilt that they have had to suffer with as a cultural shade that has overshadowed them and followed them can now, I think, be honestly extrapolated onto the whole of Western liberal democratic society, where you can just see how many people among us are psychopaths, essentially, that they can insulate themselves with the sympathy extraction, the parasitic, kind of moral redistribution program, and they can set themselves up as insulated psychopaths. They can indulge in their psychopathy, and they can get away with it. The socially successful psychopath, which was how Luigi Zorja described fascism and Hitler, at least, or Nazism. And you can see this in I was just looking at just a smattering of videos on YouTube. I don't know if it's the president of New Zealand or the foreign minister of New Zealand, who is this Maori woman who has this face tattoo to exemplify her cultural distinctive sect in this narrative, as she sings great love stories to China and things like that. Um, Singing, there's a bit of a metaphor, I guess, but she gave this weird sort of cultural poetry about how the mythology of the Maori and the mythology of the China dragon mirror how she sees the relationship between New Zealand and China, and it's all insulated nicely. There's no accountability to principles or values. It all gets swallowed into a weird surrealist narrative, where you can indulge in your moral relativism. Um, and it's weird that I don't know if it's just me, but when I see these women and these people talk, Maxine uh, Walters, am I saying her name right? I don't know if that's her surname, but you know it's just so morally vacuous. There is just it's just all branding. It's this kind of what's the word that just means that there's this pulpy, never-ending race baiting uh, that doesn't have any true target other than just because even if they win any anything that they're asking for, it's still proof that they are losers, so that they can continue the kind of the reactive, reflexive, sort of moral superiority that doesn't have a target attached to it, that doesn't have an actual expiry date of when things actually change. So it's this weird, never-ending cycle that just I do think that this is an attempt to and fascism in general has this cultural milieu, is that it is actually changing a shame-based culture in which we have a kind of we have a shared ethos of what should cause shame, and we have some cultural standards which hopefully we share and that hopefully we communicate through, and so we live in a shared common society. um, that they are switching that into a guilt-based culture in which we each have our individual copy of this um, semi-religious, uh, uh, metaphysics of racial essentialism, so that we can be immersed in this guilt-based system of equilibrium, that we're a part of building some new cultural project, some new radical. And I mean, I do see that a large contingent of this is psychological. Is that, I mean, you can say, well, society is never structured in such a way that there is an even spread of, let's say, psychological endorsement in terms of the spectrum of psychological proclivity and character within the general population. And moving into a different mix, let's just say, or a different cultural standard or a different cultural structure, um, sort of untaps or taps into a kind of a psychological potential energy, which was suppressed before, or and so you get this whole contingent of what I can only describe as a psychopathic tendency, um, that organizes itself in something that I can only describe as a kind of as an ideological collective borderline personality disorder, and this kind of which empowers psychopaths and their pseudo intellectual weasels and henchmen, the kind of the flying monkeys, the enablers of the borderline um, sort of queen bees. I wonder. There's so many small points that I want to add on this, but essentially what it all boils down to is you can imagine why we as a history as people have had such a rough time. Um, why we haven't been able to organize society so quickly into an enlightened and beautiful structure of justice and things like that, because we have this dead weight of people, a large contingent of people who just have no principles, who have who they are looking for easy solutions. They're looking for psychologically convenient excuses to sort of um, successfully operate, some kind of disgusting psychopathic schema. Um, and it's just interesting how much, let's say, negative pressure was in the culture that is almost constantly needed in order just to keep this propensity, this psychopathology at bay. And now you know that those seals have been broken, that you have this kind of mayhem, you have this kind of moral vacuity, these vacuous uh, people who are also very interested in colonizing moral language and creating their own neo-colonialism out of, ironically, it's weird that everything that they complain about is exactly what they are perpetrating in real time. it's just they are reacting against a mythology, a history, a story. They are storytellers. And because they storytell about evil things, then no one notices when they are perpetrating those evil things in the here and now, because they are, against this conflated, nebulous boogeyman and the scapegoat. But yeah, so I mean, as I say, it's caused me some grief to consider the, let's say, the equation or the calculus that uh, democracy is a failure because the people themselves have abandoned the principles and perhaps never valued and had real values enough uh, to care or to um, invest or they themselves don't care for dignity. They Dignity for them means something like racial pride, means a collective story told narrative. And being able to perpetrate psychopathy under the umbrella of such a convenient it's this kind of redistributive parasitism of morality, that if you have the right to indulge in a public extraction or a public um, supply of violence, and you can get away with that performative lived experience, then you are embodying the neo or this post-rational feeling based relativism, uh, uh, which is this Brave New World, which, I mean, also there are lots of things that you could say about Brave New World that you know although this is actually more 1984 in the sense of that they have literally been able to change what racism means, and if you're not racist like them, then they call you a racist. I mean, it's sort of, you can't uh, that social justice that should be understood as justice for the individual against groups is now a way to do some horse trading between some kind of cherry pick statistical uh, analysis of groups versus groups in order to insulate and justify a racial oligarchy, which well, at least in the South African sense, we have a racial oligarchy entrenched and insulated and protected by this identity politics, identitarian narrative. And this corruption, is never going to be extractable. You're never going to be able to remove it from the state when essentially it's not against the law, or it hasn't, no one has found the legal way to unlock the actual liberal values and principles in the constitution to say you can't, you can have your freedom of association, but the state cannot indirectly endorse this kind of anti-constitutional propaganda and rhetoric. You can't spread this kind of race baiting conspiracy theory, this Nazi fascistic way of thinking. You're not allowed to spread this psychopathic sort of moral evil. Um, we're going to put you in jail for constitutional damages. If you're going to make these claims about a racial conspiracy, about white monopoly capital, you have to prove those claims. I mean, you can't just throw out these vague general uh, racialist theories and get away with it, essentially. Um, it's essentially it's propaganda for genocide. But yeah, I mean, I guess with a lot of this is so complicated because in the broader context of the South African example, I mean it's it's so crazy. There's so many facets of it which are just ridiculous. That people will actually move to a different province because they recognize that one province is doing much worse than another province, and then they will, in effect, be voting with their feet, but then they will vote against their own footfalls. They will vote against their own movement because of this racial hatred and because of this psychopathy which has been generally permitted within the state. Um, so you have this weird kind of psychopathic schizophrenia, um, which is propped up by these racial propaganda artists, um, which in many cases receive public money to do so. And I mean, it didn't help that we had essentially a whole generation of media hacks and journalists. Uh, you know, it is it's a very disgusting advent in South Africa that we have black psychopaths and white weasels essentially, um, continuing this charade of essentially expending out the last sentiments, the last fumes of liberal democratic values, um, and translating them into a racialist storytelling. Um, and I mean, you just see these crazy things. How people will stand behind news stories of very strange incidents which seem to be politically crafted that then lead to strange people holding protest signs. Uh, it's just it's the whole thing seems like a setup. The whole thing seems very carefully calibrated, and the whittling away of the rule of law, the whittling away. Whenever Judge Schlope, who has been found malfeasant and corrupt, doing very strange things, when he is actually in the process of being removed, he just complains that there's a white conspiracy theory against him. The corrupt will always just use this race baiting and the race card to insulate themselves. And the integrity of the system itself, which should be functioning at a much higher level, the integrity of the courts to protect the democracy, to protect the people, that the constitutional protections have all been completely removed essentially by this new interpretation of social justice, this new racial invention of black economic empowerment. Never mind how much rights it infringes of the individual. It's not allowed to be challenged. It's not allowed to be questioned because they've invented something that doesn't exist in the limitations clause. They've invented a governmental prerogative, as if we live in some kind of uh, uh, sort of pure democracy or something like that. When we don't live in a pure democracy, we live in a democracy with liberal values and with a supreme constitution, which has essentially been rewritten. Um, and the crimes against the liberal order, the crimes against liberal values, they go unanswered, they go undefended. Um, Yeah, so I mean, we have lost. The society has already fundamentally changed. It has already become illiberal, and so now we're sort of like the frogs being boiled slowly. Um, but I must say, like, I don't like what Pinochet did in Chile because it was not legal. What the things that he did, he didn't have a constitution. They didn't have the legal structure developed well enough. Um, and I mean, that's the same reason why I don't like the McCarthyist era in America. Uh, when you had these commissions against, or the activities against America. I can't remember the name of the committees, and the committee against anti-American activities, or the commission for investigating anti-American activities, whatever it was called. Um, that that particular thing, that particular mechanism needs to be enforced by a rigorous, above board, structured, principled legal framework and legal system that is sophisticated enough that it can actually protect itself, that liberal structure, liberal societies, liberal values can protect themselves from things like fascism, um, that institutionally corrupt things. The South African constitution does have the capacity to protect itself, um, but the institutional corruption got there first, essentially in the judiciary. Um, so anyway, that if you, because I do think that you don't have to do all the horrible things that Pinochet did if you actually have the technical lines in the sand, so that you can point to the line in the sand and say, don't cross that, and we've got jurisprudence and we've got a structure that makes sense behind it. Um, got a comprehensive, cohesive system. Uh, Now that was all poisoned in South Africa uh, from the development of black economic empowerment and the corruption of affirmative action, um, into a race-based relative, a blind apportioning of benefits to superficial connotation and skin color instead of actual disadvantage. Uh, but and how that generally sort of that general that generalization which was permitted within the law, within secondary legislation, then essentially grew into this disgusting thing called the governmental privilege, or the executive privilege, or something like that, um, to essentially not have the judiciary thoroughly invalidate or at least identify the infringement of policy of individual rights, therefore destroying the notion of actual social justice, which is that the individual needs to be protected against uh, uh, larger entities. So it's strange how all the values in the South African Constitution have become inverted essentially, as they've become racialized and poisoned by the ideologues and the identitarians. But I mean, the biggest thing is how this has entrenched corruption and mismanagement, and allowed them to double down on their irresponsibility and to scapegoat the accountability that should have befalled them. The whole system of accountability has completely broken down because if you are allowed to make radical um, systemic structural redistribution, taking from other people's fundamental constitutional rights, because somehow that's going to empower government in its centralized way to bring up other people, that there's going to be some kind of zero-sum game of constitutionality, which is essentially what the institutionalized corruption has ended up enabling. That kind of horse trading means that there is never the executive is essentially untouchable. Uh, that in some sense the judiciary has not uh, the the judiciary has not censured the state in order to reflect on the poor decision, in some sense, that the electorate has made in endorsing this government, this national government. So essentially, there's no feedback, in some sense. Well, there's no structural um, pushback to let's say reflect on the poor decision that the electorate is making. It's as if the majority can never be wrong, and the judiciary can never reflect back to the majority that is voting for a corrupt national government that the government that it is electing is fundamentally a failure. And so, because the judiciary has sort of imbibed this kind of institute, all under the aegis of supposedly democracy, that oh no, the government, the national government, deserves to have an executive privilege. It deserves to have a governmental privilege, and it can just choose whatever policy it wants. And I mean, I guess a lot of that has been facilitated by these corrupt political appointments, in some sense, that they all belong to this cabal. They all belong to these ideologically infused, institutionally corrupt, they all agree to undermine the Constitution in this way. I mean, you can only guess at the at the if there's a patronage network that has anything attached to this. Or I mean, in some sense, perhaps the reward enough for these people is how they can instantiate a kind of psychopathic domain of entrenched power that they can exercise and enjoy as the whole of society breaks down into this illiberal sort of demonic cesspit of pure power and narrative storytelling. That essentially that becomes the source of power. Is if there's space for your narrative in the public domain, and you can broadcast your narrative, and you can get other people to not broadcast their narrative. Um, I mean, I guess what I just think is the worst part of all of this is that how the EFF actually managed to get like 30% in some municipalities in the by-elections. That if you just look at the number of EFF and you can the ANC, it's hard to know, what proportion of the ANC means what, but essentially at least half of the ANC, probably more, people who vote for the ANC are just as radical as the EFF. So, when you look at it in those kinds of numbers, you realize just how illiberal the population of South Africa really are, uh, just how racist and essentially psychopathic they are. That they will believe in this race-based morality more than anything else. They will. Well, I mean, this is perhaps a more radical fringe of people that will actually go and perform some kind of activism. But when you look at the people picketing and the kinds of slogans that they have, that you know, that they are completely fine with race narratives. That they're comfortable with racial narratives. It sits uh, uh, comfortably in their minds, and never mind the huge. I mean, what I can only imagine is the cognitive dissonance of a failing state that has been run into the ground by a black government. A society that has been gutted and destroyed. The amount of wealth that has been destroyed, the amount of sort of capital and capital flight and brain drain and people leaving the country because the country is so poorly managed, and there's so much extraction going on. you know but essentially that these pawns will actually defend their racial oligarchs, that they don't, there's nothing that, if they're just told the slogans enough times, they repeat them like chattel. These are people who effectively, uh, I mean, I mean, if you want to talk about people that supposedly have dignity, I mean, if you're going to give dignity to these kinds of people, then you're going to have to say, well, Nazis deserve the same modicum of respect and dignity, because I mean, these are equivalent, these are moral equivalents. These people, they have been indoctrinated into an ideology where the world is simple and it's based on a simple story, um, and they disown their own empowerment. They disown their own vote. They vote against their own vote. With their lack of thinking, because the identity is just so much easier, so much more automatic, and you can just get on board, and you can get taken by the zeitgeist, or get taken by the stream of time. And if you don't get to where your your destination was promised or whatever, then there's someone who you can blame. It's built in automatically. There's a scapegoat that you can blame. You can sprinkle in some interesting insights about mimetic desire and things like that. I mean, there is something about sort of the collective leviathan of the collective psyche, that this is how it operates, that you people want to be part of a culture that has some kind of shared values. And when psychopaths um, promote values and a worldview and a story which is essentially reduces everything into racial essentialism, um, and then people subscribe uh, to that worldview, they're plugged in. And I don't know if it's possible to disabuse people of this. I mean, this is something that is easier to establish than it is to undo. And the damage that has been done, the constitutional damage that has been done which in some sense has insulated a whole generation of, racial oligarchs that have established themselves now, and they have insulated their corruption in this ideological narrative, and they have these psychopaths and these weasels backing them up, and that is the majority. I mean, that they somewhat make up the majority. The only thing that sort of that holds that holds the arm back is essentially the let's say the institutional capital of actually running things with some kind of, last gasping, sort of pencil lines of structure, that having something that has at least the semblance of the rule of law, although spiritually it has no justice, it has no principles, it has no real values holding it together anymore. It's just a loose bundle of of empty forms and empty boxes. And so, the idea of the South African Republic and what it was founded on, and what it was predicated on, and based on, um, has been translated into a racialist creed for racialist oligarchs who have taken over. And I know the liberal order is only going to be reinstituted or resurrected if these people can be uh, censured by judges, if there can actually be a restitution of the liberal order, and we can actually find people who have committed crimes against the liberal order, and bring those crimes to justice. Um, because without a shared concept of justice, you don't have a society. And I do think that there is perhaps some argument to be made that South Africa should be partitioned into different provinces to become separate states, so that people that want to create a banana republic can go and perform their experiment, and other people can continue with the South African constitution unmolested, ungerrymandered by racial and other institutionally corrupt elements, by racists and racialists, and disgusting professors, and their race and gender studies, which is really no different from the Aryan studies in Nazi Germany. That they can go and try to do something strange, but the and see the difference in outcomes, and see, just how low humanity can go, like in Nazi Germany. I mean, I would want a judicial revolution at this point. We need to have a separate constitutional court. We need to have a proper constitutional court established that's actually interested in protecting the Constitution. I mean, first of all, I think that there is some argument to be made to freezing the Constitution from amendment, from things like expropriation without compensation, because how can a Constitution that was endorsed by a majority in a population now be changed by what percentage of the population still vote? Because how can a majority in parliament, even a requisite majority of 66% or 75%, although they'll obviously say that they only need 66% to change the constitution. So let's just say that they only need 66%. Why should 66% of a parliament that only has what percentage of the adults who are when a minority of people are even voting, because there has been so much voter apathy, because essentially people have unplugged themselves from politics, because it's generally seen as essentially a clown world. So these politicians, these black racial oligarchs, have got enough people to divest from politics, have failed to deliver transformation, are now being rewarded in their own failure to do more radical things by less people voting for them, but a higher proportion of the people who still continue to vote. But that general proportion has gone down. How can that general proportion that has gone down uh, I would argue that essentially to change the constitution, I mean, this is not a legal argument. This is a moral argument. But I would argue to change the constitution, you should need 66% of of the population's endorsement. You shouldn't just need 66% of the people in parliament. You should need parties that represent 66%, that actually have the. But anyway, I mean, I guess that could be argued that I'm changing the goalposts. But I would also argue. I mean, this is a blanket legal argument that now what I'm about to say is a blanket legal argument that I have made before, and I do actually believe is that you cannot you cannot what's the word, materially change the constitution. You can amend the constitution, but you cannot materially change it. You can add things to it you can enhance it and elaborate it, but you cannot revise it. You cannot that essentially that also the constitution was not made by parliament. The constitution is not an act of parliament. It is also an act of parliament, but it is not fundamentally an act of parliament. The constitution was not made by parliament, it was made by the Constitutional Assembly. It's very, very important. And also how its actual process of formulation and drafting is something that cannot be amended in some sense. As I say, it might be enhanced and elaborated, but it cannot be materially changed. That's my blanket legal argument, that actually you cannot revise the Constitution. And perhaps I'm taking too much of a poetical interpretation of the word amend, but to amend something is to remedy something, is to mend it. And the Constitution is supreme. So how can you mend something that is supreme by gutting it, by materially changing it? You're not allowed to materially change it. And that the parliamentarians that wish to materially change the Constitution are themselves uh, uh, I think that they're traitors. I think that they are treasonous. And by electing, as in by indicating that they wish the Constitution to be materially revised uh, in its, you could even say, in its spiritual form, that these are people who are demarcating themselves as enemies of the Constitution and traitors to the new South Africa. But I mean, essentially, these people, I mean, that's not old news. I mean, everyone knows that these people are overt. I mean, I just see them as psychopaths. But I mean, it's an interesting snapshot in history. We stand on the precipice of, probably a lot of bad things to happen um, in South Africa. It's an interesting time in the world. Um, it's I do think it's something of it's a, I mean, you can't really call it that calm, but I think it will be seen as the calm before the storm. But of what is to come. But and I do think that it will be nasty, but I think that on the other side of it, look, the upside is huge. If we even if we sink so low as we actually have a black Nazi fascistic political advent in South Africa, that on the other side of it, perhaps then we will understand that the German people had this Nazi fascistic, thing. Black South Africans had this nasty fascistic, thing. We are all capable of doing these nasty fascistic things. This is the problem. This is the problem inherent in psychology, inherent in humanity. Um, that we're all capable, uh, non-racially, to understand what the real problem is, and the problem is not even these oligarchs. The problem is that the people who will back these slave moralities, who will plug themselves into these storytellers, mythologies, and get on board with these narratives. The problem is that people don't like principles. They don't like values. They prefer, many of them prefer other things. And until we can actually say that the problem is in the people and not in projected onto some other thing, but we actually look to ourselves. I mean, and if we're not capable of holding ourselves accountable for our destinations and our outcomes, um, it's I mean, the only thing that I would lament is just how lackadaisical the judiciary was at defending the liberal democratic constitutional order against psychopaths and racialists and race and the never-ending race baiting, and and how the constitution was hollowed out by these termites, uh, when there could have been lines clearly drawn. But we had too many, uh, oh, I guess, black psychopaths and white weasels, giving them cover. Like John Matham on 567 medium wave. These highfalutin, in so-called, sort of with it, you know, uh, journalists, that, and where were these people when they came for justice? When they were racializing justice, they just jumped on the fucking bandwagon. Where were their principles? Because their moral grandstanding, I guess it felt too good for them not to indulge in it. It's interesting that was the same kind of sentiment also that removed Thabo Mbeki, treatment action campaign. A kind of self-righteous sentimentality. It's kind of knee-jerk, psychopathic, reflexive uh, indulgence. Anyway,